Hello and welcome to the Single Malt Frontier, where we explore the edge of innovation in American single malt whiskey, as well as other interesting topics that come up along the way. Here on the show, we do a little bit of tasting and a lot of talking, and we get really geeky with it on occasion. Usually we talk about whiskey, but the best thing about whiskey is the conversations that we get to have along the way. And we get to talking about a little bit of everything. I am your host, Doug, or as I'm known around the internet, Demi Tastes. I'm joined today, as usual, by my co-host, Phil. Sometimes on our show, the main focus isn't even about whiskey, and that is very much the case today as we welcome our guest, Nathan Layman, the Seattle brand rep for Lustau Sherries. How are you doing today, Nathan?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
So before we get into the interview, and thank you everyone for waiting while we took longer than usual to sort out technical difficulties. After the usual technical difficulties, our streaming software also had some technical difficulties from the website side, I think. So now that seems to be not a problem anymore. But if you see our stream cut out, please write in the comments to let us know, because I'm not sure that we'll know. So the joys of doing a live show. So just a little bit of self-promotion. If you are a longtime watcher of the show, you'll know that we used to call this the Demi Tastes podcast. And that was definitely a little bit egotistical of me, but it was mostly that we had no idea what to call it. So we named it after the main host, which was me. And as we move into taking this a bit more seriously, we decided that we needed a better name that captures what we do without needing a paragraph of explanation. So Single Malt Frontier is the name that we've settled on. We've been living with it for a while. We kind of like it. We're working on new branding. So let us know what you think. Technically, it's not too late to change it, but I think we're pretty happy with it. So we'd like to know if you are too. Just before we get a little bit too much farther, we kind of just wanted to make the note, since we started this show a year ago, give or take, we've considered how are we going to fund this thing, and we're realizing more and more that keeping up with weekly interviews that requires buying spirits of various sorts, we do get a lot of free samples, and thank you to everyone who has sent us free samples to help us run the show. But it's not just the money spent on these materials, it's also the time spent, and it's becoming increasingly obvious that this is not a free thing to run. We never wanted to run something like a Patreon or anything like that, because we think that this show content should be free. We really want this information to be out there in the world, and we like bringing it to you. So if you have any ideas for how you would like to support us, just reach out. I'm sure we can work something out. But in terms of getting something for what you bring to the show, Phil has been making these lovely pens out of barrel staves. So if you are at all interested in purchasing one of those, that is one way that you could fund our operations on the show. And the best way to get that right now is to join the Whiskey Lodge. There's a link in the description. The Whiskey Lodge is the Discord where we hang out and talk about whiskey and spirits and all manner of interesting things that catch our attention. And we like answering newbie questions and all sorts of stuff like that. That's where Phil and I hang out. That's the best place to ask for information about where you could buy one of these pens. Now, enough of that. Money's kind of a downer. I want to talk about Phil's current ongoing project. Phil is launching the Virginia Whiskey Tournament. I guess it's already kind of launched. I'm going to let Phil talk a little bit about what that is.
So this is the third year running the Virginia Whiskey Tournament. Every distillery that produces whiskey in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which is 54 in total, are all entered into a bracket. I'm working through filling the bracket. I started on Monday. I'm on day 3 because I had an introductory day, and then day 1, day 2, and then today's day 3. Voting proper starts on the 3rd of June with the first 2 bouts of 4 distilleries. This has been a joy to run every year. And this year, as I said last year, we're doing it bigger and better. And this year, I figured out how to do it on Instagram and Twitter. And I'm hoping to get some more distiller input from the entrants into the tournament. The trophy will again be a Jefferson Cup engraved with Virginia Whiskey Champion, because it is appropriate that a trophy for the Virginia Whiskey Tournament should be a Jefferson Cup.
Makes sense to me. And so without further ado, thanks for everyone who's dropped. And Thanks again for waiting as we've come on a little bit late, but we're letting people trickle in before we get into the meat of the content. So we have quite a lot of samples to get through today, and hopefully we won't spend too terribly long on each one of
Sorry,
them,
guys.
so that we can. Oh, I mean, I did it to us, right? That was me. I went out to the store and I bought every style of sherry that I could find. And the one thing that we have going for us is I can say more than most weeks, Phil and I have done our homework. So last night we were actually on a call for 4 hours tasting through the different styles of sherry so that we could get familiar with them and reading up just a little bit so that we could have intelligent questions today, as opposed to just the raw basics, because sort of setting that baseline of like what is sherry for us, so that we can sort of speak intelligently about it. But we're going to assume that the viewers don't know anything beyond sherry exists and is maybe a fortified wine. And beyond that, we hope that today will help you learn everything that you wanted to know and more about sherry. So without further ado, Nathan, could you please introduce yourself, tell us what you do, and tell us a little bit about the brand?
Hi, guys. So I am a brand ambassador for Lustau here in the Seattle Greater Northwest area. My job generally is to go in and do staff trainings for local bars so their bartenders can speak intelligently on the subject of sherry. The reason behind that being is that we're kind of, for lack of a better term, a niche product. I mean, there was a period of time where you had famous writers talking about sherry, and it was a regular consumed product that everybody was doing. But then by virtue of a couple world wars, prohibition, changing tastes, I mean, prohibition itself was about 19 years, so America kind of forgot how to drink. And then right as prohibition was ending, World War II began. Spain was kind of wrestling with its own collection of things with Francisco Franco and its Civil War. And so sherry kind of got forgotten by a lot of consumers, which is a shame. But alcohol, unfortunately, is a category here in the U.S. that's, there's not like we have it's not like civics class that you take in, high school or wood shop, or like, let's walk you through the basics of how to do things. There's no real good source of information that doesn't, also involve a brand probably telling you how wonderful their stuff is, which, side note, Lustau sherry is pretty awesome. But there's no really good source to go out and find this information. So that's why positions like mine exist, is so I can walk people through, especially with this topic like sherry, that in addition to kind of being a niche, of all the fortified wines out there, it is by far the most varied in terms of flavor profiles as we go through sherries, which is, as you mentioned, you had to pick up a lot of bottles to cover a lot of the flavor profiles. I mean, Lustau, we are a pretty small company. Our brand presence here in the U.S. is reasonably pretty good. That has more to do with the fact that we cover most of the styles of sherry. We have some 40 odd SKUs of sherry. Granted, there's really kind of five, depending on who you're talking to, 5 main styles of dry sherry, which is the vast majority of production. That's where a lot of it tends to jump up from there. Cream sherry is being a blend of dry and sweet, and then it becomes a question of what is the base dry sherry involved, and what is the ratio of sweet to dry. You'll have rich cream sherries, which are like a 60-40 blend, and then the one you guys have on hand, and I have myself here, which is the East India Solera. That's more like an 80-20, 90-10 blend, so it's going to be a little on the drier side. There's also something that makes East India Solera especially different from regular cream sherries, which we'll get into when we get there. Now, what differentiates the sherries, because all sherries come from 3 grapes. All the dry sherries are from the same grape. It's the Palomino Fino grape. Now, what differentiates the dry sherries is a question of how they are aged, because all of them are made the same fermentation style, same growing. They grow in the same soil. It's called, in Spain, it's called the Albariza. It's this chalky white soil. That part of Spain, thousands or hundreds of thousands of years ago, was essentially underwater. So all those diatomus, I'm not a geologist, essentially sea creatures, that their carcasses, as they be turned into soil over thousands of years, left at this white, chalky, spongy soil, which is important because that part of the world gets very little rain. As such, what little rain does get, it soaks up in the ground, and the wine vines are able to kind of feed from it as the years progresses. And then on top of that, you have two separate winds that go through there. You have the Poniente, which is coming off of the Atlantic. It's very wet, cooling. And then you have the Levante, which is coming off of North Africa, so very hot and dry. So you'll see some ranges in temperatures as the days and the weeks kind of go through. So that's the where is also important in that it grows in what's Andalusia, which if you look at the Iberian Peninsula, looks like a head. The face is essentially Portugal, and where the neck starts to begin is basically Gibraltar. So Andalusia is just a little north and west of where the neck is. It's all sherries are made in the Sherry Triangle. It's 3 towns. You have Jerez de la Frontera, which is kind of where the name for sherry comes from. It's an Anglicization / corruption of Jerez, which through just people not pronouncing it very well, ended up becoming sherry. You have El Puerto de Santa Maria, which is on the coast. It's a little north, but very much west of Jerez. And then very north of there, you have Sanlúcar de Barrameda, which is on the coast. El Puerto de Santa Maria is an inland port, whereas Sanlúcar is right on the ocean. Now, why that I bring that up is also partially where sherry is aged determines what style of sherry. In that, with the 2 dry styles that I'm going to first pour, we first up have Fino, which is what I call biologically aged, as well as Manzanilla. Here we go. So the dry sherries, as I said, all come from one grape, and it's a question of how they're aged to determine the sherries. Now, there's essentially 2 ways of aging sherries. There is biologically aged, means the sherry is aged under a layer of yeast called flour. What that does is it protects it from exposure to oxygen. Now, the other style of sherry is called oxidatively aged, which you'll see I've also poured some Amontillado. This is in comparison to the Fino and Manzanilla, which is you see is very white, whereas the Amontillado is this copper color. We're drinking the Amontillado.
There's my Amontillado there. Yep.
Yeah, Amontillado Los Arcos. So it's through controlled oxidation. Why I mention that is the 2 things that all wines have to deal with for spoilage is either acidification, which is converting the alcohol in the wine into acetic acid. That's what makes vinegar. Now, the way to combat that is by raising the alcohol content of the wine, hence why fortified wines exist, is that it rises enough to about 19-20%, which is way too hot for the bacteria that would convert it into acetic acid. The other process that wines have to concern themselves with is oxidation. Now, you can't stop that. I mean, we're swimming in oxygen as we speak right this second. What you can do is gently introduce the oxygen to the wine slowly over time. Now, how sherry casks are aged, they're aged in giant 600-liter casks, but they're only filled 5/6 of the way, so the remaining 100 liters is left open. That's allowing the floor to grow on top of the 2 wines, the Fino and the Manzanilla. And in the case of the Amontillado and the other 2, which we'll bring up later, Palo Cortado and Oloroso, that just allows enough room for the oxygen to kind of seep into the cask through the pores of the barrels. Now, what differentiates Fino and Manzanilla is where the wines are aged. Fino you find in both Jerez and in El Puerto de Santa Maria. Manzanilla is exclusive to Sanlúcar de Barrameda. Now, the reason for that is the yeast culture itself likes a consistent temperature. Because Sanlúcar is right on the water, sea towns tend to have very consistent temperatures. The reason for that being is water takes an extraordinarily large amount of energy to change its temperature. That's why it's used for coolants in nuclear reactors, is because it takes so much energy to change its temperature. But that also translates into the yeast growing much more robustly on the wines in Sanlúcar. So as such, the effect on the wine is much more pronounced. In addition, because of all that salinity or salt in the air, you get a lot more crispness and green to the apple, which if you taste them side by side, you can definitely taste the difference between a Fino and a Manzanilla.
Yeah, my experience with Fino has been that it's a little bit honey on the nose, but it's very sort of very tart and bitey on the palate. It's exceptionally dry, right?
Yeah.
When I was first getting into sherry, I was warned by someone in the whiskey lodge that sherry, like good sherry, quote unquote, is bone dry, and to just be prepared for that as going into it for the first time, it might be a bit bracing.
Yeah, it is. I kind of liken it to introducing people to Scotch whiskeys, where it's easier to start with the cream sherries, which are kind of like the Speysides, not overly peated. You're just getting kind of the basics of the Scotch, and then moving around the coast, eventually ending in Islay. Because the last thing you want to do is give them an Ardbeg Supernova or Octomore or something that's a giant, peat bomb. So the similar thing with sherries, in that you would start with the cream sherries and maybe go to Oloroso and Palo Cortado, and then down into the Finos and Manzanillas. Because what the biological aging also does to the sherries is the yeast consumes glycerols within the wine. All the wines, all 5 of the dry wines, are fermented to completion, meaning there's no sugar left in the wine. It's all been converted into alcohol. But some of the glycerols and some of the things still in the wine respond on the oxidatively aged wines. So you get, with your Amontillados and your Palo Cortados, in addition to that copper color, you're also getting kind of that marzipan, almost caramel thing to them. Even though there's technically no more sugar than in the other 2 wines, you still see, what you would regard as sweetness, or your palate or nose kind of picks up as a slight sweetness.
Yeah, so my impression, somewhat true of whiskey too, that there's not a lot of sugar in whiskey. Most of the sweetness is coming from, to the extent there is sugar in whiskey, it's coming from, I guess, the wood sugars.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pause for a second while that plane passes, or fire truck or whatever.
Oh, it's fire truck, yeah.
And here's the ambulance.
Yeah,
there it goes.
So yeah, to the extent that there's sugar in whiskey, it's coming from the wood sugars, because sugar basically doesn't make it through the distillation process. In the case of sherry, or any wine that's been fermented totally dry, all that sugar's been consumed. So your perception of sweetness is actually coming from smells, I guess, olfactory senses that your brain is telling you are associated with sweet things. And usually that's enough. Sometimes things are so dry, though, that it feels like they need a little bit of sugar to just like open up that complexity, right? I think that's sort of my feeling about Fino and Manzanilla. They've grown on me. One reason I wanted Phil to try them yesterday is so that he had a chance to like adjust, because that sort of, brace yourself, it's bone dry. I did not like Fino pretty much at all at first, and Manzanilla I think even less. But they've grown on me. I really like Fino now, especially as an accompaniment to food, the sorts of things that you'd serve a dry white wine with, just in general. I don't know that it's something that I would sit and sip as a replacement for whiskey necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe that's not its function, at least on my bar.
I mean, for most of these wines, at least the first 5 wines that we're tasting, they're wwines you would pair with your dinner. The Spanish have a saying, I don't speak Spanish, or I speak it very poorly. With things that swim, you would pair them with Fino or Manzanilla. With things that fly, you would pair them with Amontillado and Palo Cortado. And with things that run, you pair them with Oloroso. Now,
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. Getting into the oxidatively aged, I'm going to actually kind of jump over to Oloroso.
Okay. Just
because that's kind of the more robust, as I said, the things that run. We're doing Don Nuno, Oloroso. So, one of the things I didn't mention about the fermentation process is all the Fino, the Manzanilla, the Amontillado, and Palo Cortado are all from the first pressings of the grape, whereas Oloroso is generally from the second pressing of the grape. So you have a much more robust wine. It's got a lot more tannic action added to it just from the skin contact. Maybe a little bit of stems and seeds as well, but granted, it's just a much more robust wine, and that's exclusively oxidatively aged. In the case of both Palo Cortado and Amontillado, both of those wines begin their lives as either a Fino or Manzanilla. So they start out biologically aged. At some point in the process, that is stopped, and then the alcohol content is raised to kill off the yeast cultures, and you're left with a wine that is then spends the rest of its time aging oxidatively. It's just a question of, in those wines, roughly how much. Amontillado tends to be more of a 50-50 split, whereas Palo Cortado is more of a little time aging biologically and most of its time aging oxidatively. But a lot of that is due to both the winemaker and, as I kind of mentioned before we got on camera, Palo Cortado, there is a lot of mythology behind it. Essentially, the wine itself. The winemakers, they'll taste that first pressing of the grape. They'll decide to themselves, this is going to be a beautiful wine as a Fino or Manzanilla, depending on which town they're from. So that's the wine I want to make here. But for whatever reasons, the floor never sets, or the wine itself essentially tells the winemaker, no, what we're going to do is we're going to get the best of both worlds by getting a little bit of biological aging and then more so oxidative aging. In the case of Amontillados, as often as not, the winemaker will taste that first pressing and go, nah, it's not going to be a good Fino or Manzanilla, so we're just going to split the difference and take advantage of both aging styles to get the best of both worlds. So you'll see a lot of similarities between Amontillado and Palo Cortado. But as I said, it's also a question of what the split is between those two aging styles.
Mm-hmm. I want to take a quick step back here. So we've gotten into things that have a significant color to them, that sort of copper color. And just as a quick preview, we're gonna get to molasses, basically, when we get towards the end with the PX.
Pedro Jimenez, yes.
So that dark color. So first of all, just correct me if I'm wrong. You said there's 3 grapes that are used for making sherry.
Mm-hmm.
They are all white grapes, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's like misconception number 1 that I believed for a very long time, and I've heard a lot from whiskey drinkers, is that sherry is a red wine, and that's why it imparts this copper color, right? The wine, yes, the wine has this copper color, but the grapes are actually white grapes, which makes it a white wine. Actually. Yeah. So that color, maybe I'm gonna probably jump way ahead right here and talk about the casks for a second. So sherry casks tend to be used for a long time, tend to be really inert in terms of color and flavor imparted. So that color is also not coming from the cask.
No, not at all.
Where is the color coming from?
That's the effect of oxidation on the wine over time.
And no other cause.
No,
it's all oxidation.
No, the sherry casks themselves. I mean, you'll see casks that are 100 years old. I mean, it takes about 50 to 60 years of seasoning. When I say seasoning, is they'll put sherries that are probably not going to be sold in production, lesser sherries, as it were, are just put in the cask for the first 50 to 60 years of that cask's life, essentially to get rid of all the tannins, break down any sort of chemical reaction that the cask might provide. Which, sidebar, in case anyone's curious, the sherry casks are made using American oak. The reason for that being is just the tightness of the cask, so you don't have to worry about leakage or the pores, or it's easily to control the exposure of oxygen to the sherry. A lot of it is just through the natural breathing action. As it gets hot, the cask expand a little during the day, and then at night as it cools off, it retracts. And so it's just minute exposure to oxygen over long periods of time. So after 50 to 60 years of essentially this sherry that is, as I said, the kind of the lesser product that they put in there to strip all the flavoring or things that might affect the sherry out. So then from 60 years on, it is simply just a vessel to hold the sherry and allow either the biological aging process to happen or to control the exposure to oxygen of the oxidatively aged sherries. And they'll hold on to those sherry casks until they turn into splinters. They might replace a stave. That's why, Phil, you were asking, is to possibly get sherry cask aging for your pen? Probably not. The sherry houses do not let their sherry casks go, except under basically pain of death kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll talk more about casks later for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered so far Fino and Manzanilla very briefly. We'll come back around, I think, and do some tasting notes as time allows. So we've done Fino and Manzanilla, which are the driest, and we
Yeah.
sort of skipped over to Oloroso.
Well, we can go back to Amontillado and Palo Cortado. The reason why I kind of jumped like I did with that is I wanted to explain the exclusively oxidatively aged sherries and how they differ from the biologically aged sherries. And just so we knew with both Palo Cortado and Amontillado that it's the split of the difference between those two styles of aging.
Did a bad job of labeling my glasses, and now I forgot which one was my Palo Cortado. I think I figured it out.
So in this case, we're using. This is Palo Cortado Peninsular. Now, on the what I'll point out on the style bottles is this little hieroglyphic at the top. This is the indicator of the style of sherry that all sherry producers use. They put it on the outside of the barrel so you know which barrels you're working with. Palo Cortado being the style of sherry. Peninsula, that's specific to Lustau in our history. And then it kind of goes into, well, you can see three different spellings of essentially sherry or Jerez on the bottom. The town of Jerez has been around for probably over 3,000 years. Originally, it was a Phoenician town. Jerish was the name of the town, which is where it was when it became a Spanish pronunciation, became Jerez. And then ultimately, as I said, where it was corrupted into the word sherry itself. But there's been winemaking in that part of the world for well over 3,000 years. They're not sure if it originated there, or if more likely the Phoenicians, who were kind of the Johnny Appleseeds of winemaking in the Mediterranean, if they brought it with them when they colonized that town and formed it.
So, among other things, I'm a little bit of a linguistics nerd. I noticed that the denomination to origin on the back of the bottle has this other sort of glyph, which looks a little like Arabic, but not really. Is that the Phoenician markings that mean?
I think that glyph is just an impressionist take on a copita or a small wine glass that the sherry is consumed from.
Oh, okay. I'll try to get that closer to the camera so people can see. That makes sense actually, but it looks like language, right?
I mean, it is a legitimate question because most of Spain at one time was controlled by the Islamic Empire, and in fact, a lot of the distillation technology that we now take for granted here in the U.S. actually came up through that part of Europe. So the alembic still, as we know it, is actually originally an Arabic word. It's al-ambiq, which is how a lot of Spanish brandies are made, is using the alembic still. Granted, the Islamic people were not drinking booze; they were using it to make medicines. But still, the local Catholics jumped on that, and it's kind of how we get a lot of the lovely spirits we enjoy today.
So are we? Should we be comparing Amontillado and Palo Cortado right now?
Yeah, I like to. Just the differences aren't going to be quite as stark as you saw with Fino and Manzanilla. And what can be fun for a lot of people is to try Amontillados from different cities. As I mentioned, Amontillado and Palo Cortado began their life as either a Fino or Manzanilla, depending on which town they were in. And you will see a definite difference in the palate from Amontillados that are one-time Manzanillas or Palo Cortados that are one-time Manzanillas. It's really part of the fun of sherry is as much as any product, it is very much a result of where it is from, that the terroir and in some cases the terroir, as I like to say. Just the effect of how that plays across. As you mentioned, you have also a California sherry, which not in any way to disparage the product they have, but it's not sherry. It's not having the benefit of having grown in the Albariza soil or having, the different winds, the waters, everything that makes that part of Spain the beauty that it is. It's just not the same thing. You can call it whatever you like, but it's not sherry.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't. It can't be sold in the EU, I think, because the DO using the word sherry would be a violation of the protected term.
Which, I mean, when I was younger, I thought was kind of funny. But I mean, you guys doing American malt whiskeys, in no way are American malt whiskeys lesser compared to Scotch whiskeys. They're just very different whiskeys because what makes Scotland Scotland plays out in the whiskeys it has.
Yep. Thankfully, the term single malt is not restricted to
Thankfully,
Scotland.
Yeah, it's not like the word
but
Tabasco.
Scotch whiskey is. Yeah.
So you will definitely see a noticeable difference in the flavor, which with Palo Cortado kind of both taking on the yeasty characteristics you get from the Fino and the Manzanilla, as well as that more robust oxidative aging you see in the Olorosos.
So I think Amontillado was my first, the first sherry that really clicked with me before I went out and bought this whole bevy of I want to try all these different styles. I had gone, I'd gone to restaurants and I'd started trying sherries, and I tried PX, obviously. I knew that was going to be a dessert wine, so that was an easy thing to do. I definitely tried Amontillado. I don't remember exactly whether it was the first, second, third. I think it was I took my in-laws out for brunch and I was like, well, I'm getting into sherry, right? Let's take a chance on ordering a sherry from this nice brunch place. And I think what I ordered was a Lustau Amontillado. And then Oloroso as well. So those are the ones that came up. Fino and Manzanilla kind of aren't, right? You just don't see them as much, I think.
Yeah, I mean, some of that owes to the fact that they're, by virtue of the biological aging, they're much more delicate wines. There's a certain amount of seasonality you'll see in Spain. Fino and Manzanilla tends to be like a spring, early summer style of wine. Some of that is also kind of the meals you're having, where it's, when it's hot out, you're not really looking to have a giant lamb shank. A nice whitefish when it's super hot out with some salad, which the beauty of sherry is, as I said, all these dry styles of sherry is there's something you pair with food. It's traditionally you'd have like any other glass of wine. And that's the beauty of sherry is how well it works with food. So what you would generally have, the lighter summer fare, tends to work very well with Finos and Manzanillas.
Yeah. I think my thought at that point, when I was having brunch, I was like, okay, I'm going to order like sweet French toast and pair that with a dry sherry. I don't know why that made sense in my head. It did work really well.
Okay.
It was like waffles or something where it wasn't like super sweet on its own. So you could go either way. You could like have the waffles with a sip of sherry, or you could have, and it had like fruit on top, or you could put the maple syrup on top and sort of go that other way and make it sweet. So both of those things were an option. And then Palo Cortado I discovered actually kind of accidentally, which was I guess that's ironic because I've heard it said that Palo Cortado is kind of an accidental wine. Started off trying to be something else, and then the floor died off, and now it's oxidatively aged where it wasn't intended. Is there truth to that? I guess first of all,
there is a lot of mythology behind Palo Cortado. It does, as I mentioned earlier. These are all for the first four wines, the Fino, the Manzanilla, the Amontillado, Palo Cortado, are all from the first pressings of the grape. So traditionally the winemaker would try the wine, and what they ideally want is they want to produce a really nice Fino or Manzanilla. And in the case of Palo Cortados, historically speaking, that was the intent of the winemaker, saying this is a beautiful wine. I want to make my best expression, so it'll be either a Fino or Manzanilla, depending on which town they're coming from. Amontillados are kind of a compromise where this is the first pressing of the grape, but it's never going to be a beautiful wine. So we're going to play with both these styles of aging to result in the Amontillado and get this fun wine out of it. Not that it's a bad wine, but just it's not going to present itself in its best form as a Fino Manzanilla. In the case of the Palo Cortado, that was the intent, but for whatever reason, the floor never kind of got going. It just never grew into the robust level of covering that you really want with your wine to age it appropriately biologically. And even then, I didn't bring this. There's another fun wine that you'll find with both Finos and Manzanillas. Part of what makes sherry sherry, I'm going to have to jump off to the side for here, is what's called the Solera system. Now, you'll probably see that in a fair number of spirits where they say Solera aged or Solera this or Solera that. sherry is what originated the Solera system. What it is, it's a system of fractional aging and fractional blending that is done over time to create a consistent product, harvest over harvest over harvest over harvest. Now, the way I like to describe it is think of a pyramid of, say, 6 barrels. We have 3 barrels at the bottom. These are your oldest wines. This is where the bottling comes from. So you pull the wine out of there to bottle, and then it's from the 2 middle barrels, which are kind of a mix of the freshest and oldest. That's where the juices then move down to the bottom barrels, and the top barrels where you put the fresh stuff in. So over time, you essentially have this mixture of sherry. So trying to establish this as the age of it is hard to do because you'll have, since it's not like the youngest stuff instantly comes out, you could have very young wines in the bottom of the barrel, and you could also have wine from when the cask was first, set down, which could be hundreds of years. So you get a consistent flavor profile year over year over year, but you're also the other important part of that is you're reintroducing food back into the system for the flora, the yeast cultures that grows on top of the wine to continue being able to eat. Even in ideal circumstances, that flora will only live around 8 to 10 years. So you'll see some Finos and Manzanillas that become almost a reverse Palo Cortado, where it has 8 to 10 years of biological aging and then 1 or 2 years of oxidative aging. I can't remember the term off the top of my head. I want to say it's like a Manzanilla Passata, which just means like an older Manzanilla. So it has some interesting but inverted characteristics, much like Palo Cortado, because it's doing the same thing, but you're having opposite ratios of biological to oxidatively aged. It's just once you start getting nerdy with sherry, it can be a fun experience to jump in on that.
Interesting. So let's see. Palo Cortado, as I was saying, it seemed rare. This was the hardest one for me to find. I searched at least 6 different wine shops before I actually found it. And that actually prompted me to go ask on the Seattle, Washington subreddit, where the heck do you buy your sherry, right? Like, why can't I find any of, I know that the stuff exists. I know that there's all these different styles. Where are they? Who's carrying this stuff? So I did finally find one. And before that, I'd only seen it on a menu at a restaurant once.
Yeah.
And it happened to be in Dallas, and I ordered that. And at the time, my impression of it was that it was as if a tawny port was a sherry, but like less sweet.
Yeah.
And again, I didn't have a whole lot of experience with sherry, so that was probably misguided. I think I feel more that that's Oloroso at this point. But it varies. I'm sure it varies from expression to expression as well.
It very much does. Yeah, I mean, because terroir and with the base wine, if it was a Fino or Manzanilla comes into play, it can result in a very different product at the final bottling. Part of what makes it difficult to get hold of, quite frankly, is just demand. I mean, because so few people are asking for sherries, not a lot of companies, or I'm sorry, just distributors, wine shops are necessarily carrying the full line. They just think that they can get away with 1 or 2, and that covers the gamut of sherry, which is part of my larger frustration with aromatized wines and fortified wines in general. People say, "Oh, I just picked up a bottle of sweet red vermouth." It's like, well, no, vermouth is very different depending on where you're getting it from, but that's a whole other discussion, longer.
That's so funny. At this point, I drink more sherry than I use vermouth, and I actually, because of that, I was starting to ask the question. Well, I've got a lot of open sherry, and like it lasts longer than regular wine, but it's not going to last forever. So, how am I going to use this sherry? And I was thinking, it's got a kind of herbal quality to it, right? Maybe I'll put it in a cocktail that I would, let's say, bitters can carry some of the weight of herbal. So why don't I try a sherry in a cocktail that I would otherwise use sweet or dry vermouth in, depending. And it's okay. It works okay, but it's not the same.
There are a lot of great I mean, that's part of the beauty of sherry, especially pre-prohibition, is it was a very popular product that people are using. So there's actually a lot of old classic cocktails that call for sherry in it. The challenge you run into with old cocktail manuals is often as not the bartender, much like a magician, didn't want to reveal all their secrets because they didn't want people making the drinks at home. They wanted them to come into the bar to get the properly made drink. So you'll have it request dry sherry, which, I mean, we have now tasted 5 different styles of dry sherry that are wildly different and can result in a very different product. But you can kind of back your way into it in terms of which spirits tend to work best with which sherries. I mean, I tend to use, if I'm going to be working with whiskeys, Oloroso, because it has that heft to it, can often stand up to American ryes and American bourbons. Palo Cortado, maybe with kind of your lightly aged tequila or agave spirits and lightly aged rums. And then when you start talking like eau de vies or gins or vodkas, then your white spirits, the Fino and Manzanillas tend to work very well with those. But that said, there are a lot of, I mean, some of the most, the earliest cocktails, like the sherry cobbler, it's right there in the name, sherry. It's a wonderful drink, great for the summertime. But, you know, there's the Adonis, there's the Bamboo, there's the Up-to-Dates. There's a lot of great old sherry classics. And then with the cocktail renaissance, you know, us nerdy bartenders will find, oh, sherry, here's the thing we can play with. And so there's a lot of more recent versions that you can use sherry in place of, or that specifically call for sherry, especially depending on the style.
All right, 5 styles of dry sherry.
5 styles of dry sherry.
We've talked technically what the differences are, but we haven't talked a whole lot about flavor profiles. So I'd love if we could do that just briefly before we move on to the sweets. And I'm going to give Phil an opportunity to. Well, Phil, it's up to you when you think the poem reading is appropriate.
Well, I think perhaps when we start to talk about Amontillado in a little bit more depth in terms of like flavor profiles, because you know that is part of the point of the poem or short story, I think is what it technically is, because it isn't really a poem. I just sort of read it like one.
Okay. Well, we talked a little bit about Amontillado, but all right, let's go through some flavor notes here. So I think it makes sense probably to like do a couple of flavor notes from the driest first. So Phil, you're great with flavor notes. I'll let you sort of kick that off.
So the Fino is the most yeasty, like sort of dry bready notes, and like just a hint of like skin on apples, not baked or caramelized.
Smells quite nice on the nose. It's tart on the palate, right? It's like really dry apple juice.
Very crisp.
Yeah, crisp apple juice from like one of those green apples that isn't super sweet. Like maybe, I don't know, Granny Smith or
yeah.
I don't know my
this is
apple
gonna
variety
sound
as well as I probably should.
This is gonna sound really mean. I used to have a crab apple tree in my backyard.
Yeah.
And this tastes like when I was a kid, and I'd go, "Oh, hey, I'm gonna eat a crab apple." You know, free snack while I'm out messing around in the yard. It was always a bad idea.
Tasty.
Yeah, there was a period of time with the Manzanilla where they weren't quite sure what the etymology was behind the word. And in Spanish, the word for apple is manzana. So there were, if I don't know, we haven't quite got to the Manzanilla yet, but there's definitely with that salinity and the yeastiness, for me, much more so than with the Fino, that crisp green apple definitely comes to the fore on the flavor profile for me.
Yep.
And so it was thought that maybe Manzanilla was essentially mean like a little green apple, just when you add a little ila on the end of in the Spanish words.
Yeah.
They've subsequently figured out that no, it came from somewhere else entirely, but that legend still persists. And
I definitely, as of last night, I still thought that, and I was looking it up, and I was like, oh, I don't know if I just made that up or if I heard that from somebody, but
no,
the article I found said
that was definitely
true.
a common idea that people had.
Yeah, so I think this is it's a nice, delicate wine. I have sat and sipped this. I enjoy that. I also like cooking with it. I think it's really good for making like a let's say like in linguine and clams or something like that. That
Yeah.
sort of seafood based sauce. That sort of same thing where you'd put in a crisp white wine. This works really well, and it adds more flavor, more depth of flavor. Oh, French onion soup,
Mhm.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I really boozed up a batch of French onion soup once.
Well, I've always been a huge proponent too of it. If you're going to cook with wine, it should be a wine that you're willing to drink on its own.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah. Well, what's the rule? A glass for the dish, a glass for me.
yeah. I think that's a pretty good rule.
All right, so the obvious direct comparison, essentially directly comparison, different town, right?
Yeah.
Same
Different
grape.
town. Yep. Same aging
Okay.
process. Same the pressing, the fermentation, everything up until it gets into the cask is exactly the same. It's just by virtue of because Manzanilla is aged in right there on the water with that consistent temperature, so the yeast can grow much more robustly, as well as the salinity. Like I once had a Fino from another producer from not San Lucar, but from El Puerto de Santa Maria, which, as I mentioned, is an inland port. But the aging bodega, bodegas in Spain are the aging houses, the rack houses, essentially. The bodega was high up on the hill, so it was getting a lot of the wind blowing sea air into the bodega. So you had roughly a split where it kind of tasted like the more traditional, just yeasty Fino, but you also had the salinity very much like a Manzanilla. So it was just really fun when you have, even though it's only a collection of a couple miles, how profound effect that has on the larger product that it turns out.
So as I alluded to earlier, Manzanilla I think has been the hardest for me to come around to liking.
Yeah.
I really wasn't sure if I liked it at all to start with, and it grew on me. I think I could always appreciate the complexity that it offers, but it was one of those things where it's like, okay, that's interesting, but I'm not sure if I like it.
Yeah.
It is by far the most aggressive on the palate, in my personal opinion. It wants to be more assertive about the flavors that are present within it.
Yeah, and which is funny because again, with having so much in common in the entire process, and yet you results in a very different wine, you can't exactly use it interchangeably. Getting back to our cocktail discussion, one of my favorite cocktails is called a Tuxedo Number 2, which is basically a martini, but instead of dry vermouth, uses a dry sherry. Now, the reason for that, for me, is dry sherry still has a lot of sugar in it. The wormwood adds a lot of bitterness to the aromatized wine, which is fine when you're only having one. But by your second or third martini, that sugar gets very cloying for my palate. So I really like to use either Fino or Manzanilla in place, just because all that sugars been fermented out. It ends up in a very much drier cocktail, and also just as importantly, for someone who really wants to show off the gin itself, it allows the gin to speak. Gin is wonderful for making cocktails with, but part of why it's so wonderful for making cocktails with is it makes everything else in the glass taste better, and then it fades into the background, much like Emmylou Harris when she's singing with other singers. Merle Haggard suddenly sounds wonderful, and you forget that it's because Emmylou Harris is there. So in this case, because the Fino and Manzanilla are also subtle players, it allows the gin to shine as well. But you get a very different cocktail depending on whether you're going with Fino or Manzanilla in that case, because they're both, in my opinion, delicious wines, but very different results.
So I want to take a little geeky side path for a moment. So I've heard about malic acid as being a reason for some of the flavors in especially these Fino and Manzanilla, but especially Manzanilla, and malic acid. I guess being one of the components that gives you those appley flavors. But I read somewhere in my research on sherry that malic acid can also be a reason that flor has trouble growing. So how, I guess, given that Manzanilla has so much malic acid, but it's also completely biologically aged, I guess, how does that balance get struck there?
That would be a question
and...
I'd have to approach the winemaker too. I mean, I have some familiarity with it just as part of the winemaking process, historically speaking, that they would alter the acidic content of the wine itself. The challenge that would come from that, though, is that by changing the pH, you encourage a lot of odd bacteria to grow, resulting in off flavors and that potentially could ruin your wine. Although with the changes in technology from now, you don't really see people jumping around on stomping grapes with their feet anymore in vats. It's just mechanically done. That's not quite as much an issue. But yeah, I'd have to ask the malic acid question. That one is something I'm familiar with, but the whys and the wherefores behind it, I can't speak to that.
Fair enough. Okay, that I don't know why this sparked this question in my head at this time, but the concept of the sherry bodega, right? The winemakers in the various locations. Since the Instagram handle for Lustau is Bodegas Lustau, which sort of, I guess that's raising this question for me of, are Lustau's wines all sourced from bodegas that are owned by or specifically affiliated with the brand, or is it more of an independent arrangement?
So, and this is kind of actually reaches into the history of Lustau itself. Now, most sherry producers do not grow their own grapes. I mean, that's just a massive capital investment. I think like some of the other sherry houses do some of their own grapes, but for the most part, pretty much everybody buys their grapes from small producers. In fact, Lustau originally got its start back in the mid 19th century as they're called almacenistas. The almacenistas you can think of as just like small cask or small producers who then sell their sherry to a larger house and then blends it into the house style. All the bottles I'm showing you here, it's what's called our familiar line. Legally, these small producers cannot put their label on a bottle and sell their own sherry as with their name on it. In order to do so, you have to become a bottler, which is a whole different tax bracket. And in fact, Lustau did not become a bottler until the 1960s. The reason I bring that up is because in homage to our beginnings as small producers, starting in the 1980s, we started bottling what's called our almacenista line, where we show off the individual producers that sell to us and contract with us to sell their juice that we then blend into our larger style. What we will do, and you'll see the almacenistas out in our production line at the stores, we'll put the name of the individual producers on the bottle, as well as the town that it's coming from, so that we can show off. We're proud of the people that work with us that can show off. They're essentially a small batch or single cask production style, as you translate in the whiskey world, sherries, and they're really beautiful. One of my favorites is a Oloroso called Pato di Gallina. The name comes from hen's foot. The reason that comes up is the Oloroso. This little this is what a hen's footprint in the sand can look like. And so the producer, he was like the younger son of the family. He didn't expect to take over the sherry business, so he went out and became a motorcycle repairman and motorcycle dealer, and that was his life. And I think his older family members passed away, and so he inherited the sherry production, and his family makes beautiful sherries. And so the Pato Gallina Oloroso, which I think is from Jerez, is really a lovely, lovely sherry. But we have a number of them showcasing the various towns specifically, so you can see how the terroir and how that affects depending on where the sherry is being produced.
Okay, so you say from Jerez, which I looked this up last night, but I've already forgotten the distinction. So the sherry producing region is known as Jerez, right?
Well, it's Andalusia is the region of Spain. Jerez is the main town, Jerez de la Frontera. Okay. The de la Frontera part is because at the one point this was the bleeding edge of Catholicism's control of Spain. So at one point it was kind of the Wild West of Spain, and it is the capital region. But the sherry's produced in the triangle. Well, all sherry has to be aged in that triangle to be considered sherry. There is one exception to that rule that we'll get into with the Pedro Jimenez. A lot of Pedro Jimenez is not necessarily made in the sherry triangle. It is aged there. That's what makes it sherry. But the production of it can actually happen in other regions. In the case of Pedro Jimenez, there are a couple regions near to sherry, specifically Malaga and Montilla, that especially Montilla. Montilla makes a wine. The Montilla wines are very similar to sherries, but they use Pedro Jimenez grapes, which sherry does have, but it's done in the dry styles, much like the ones we've just tried, just with a different grape. And the name Amontillado, as I mentioned to Philip earlier, that is essentially the Spanish way of saying Amontillado is a little like the wines of Montilla. That's where the name comes from.
Okay. So in the case of this bottle, so like just getting my terminology right. So this says
you have the
Almacenista.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's not a fanciful name of this particular Amontillado, I guess, but it's referring to the specific independent.
Yeah, the name of the independent producer will be on that wine. I want to say it is Obregon.
Yeah. So this says Obregon.
Yeah, so it has the gentleman's name on it that produces that sherry for us. He makes the grapes that we then blend into our larger styles of sherry. But in this case, because he legally would not be able to bottle his own sherry and show off this great product that he makes, we put his name on the bottle so people know that this is who we buy from and that we're proud of the work that he does. And so this is one of his sherries. And that's, you could think of that as like a specialty bottling or small batch, single cask, that kind of thing, style of sherry, which there are technically, what's the word I'm looking for? Sherry, as I said, is done traditionally in the Solera system. So it's a fractional aging blending. However, every so often there will be one barrel that is so specific that they'll pull it out of the Solera system and they'll let it age on its own. So you have like a Pedro Jimenez from like 1984, and I can't remember what the name for that is. Forgive me, I should have written it down. But that's really kind of a really fun specialty bottling you'll see from sherries is when it's a specific year. It's not necessarily the most representative of what the sherry. It could just be this is a particularly interesting or weird bottling. But more often than not, it really is where the sherry producer wants to really showcase what that individual year was really beautifully doing. Vintage, that's
right.
How could I forget that word?
I was about to say, so that sounds a lot like a vintage port.
Yeah.
Okay, so far we've sort of dissected this sort of difference in flavor profile between Fino and Manzanilla, and like in summary, basically they're both pretty dry. They both kind of remind us of tart dry apples. But the Manzanilla has more of those yeasty sort of flavors to it. So it's a little more mushroomy, maybe more earthy, that sort of thing. It's got a nice complexity to it. It's obvious even before I knew about Flor, which by the way, Flor, just for the listeners and anyone who's not familiar with that term. So Flor being that layer of yeast and meaning flour, right? So even before I knew about that, I did get the feeling that this was mushroomier in sort of my whiskey vocabulary, I guess you would say.
Yeah, a lot of that has to do with essentially the lees, which is a winemaking term, is the dead yeast cells through the aging of the wine as that settles to the bottom of the cask. That definitely that yeasty flavor continues to affect the wine, and you get that mushroomy umami flavor, very much pronounced in Fino Manzanilla.
Right, which is really good for cooking, right? That's exactly what you want when you're cooking a savory dish. Yeah, and then so then we move on to the slightly more oxidized style. So we have the Amontillado, which for me that makes sense as the next thing to talk about. And like this I think, as I was saying to Phil last night, this is where we start getting into more of the whiskey-like flavors that whiskey drinkers would be familiar with, because whiskey flavors are a lot of that. They have a lot of that oxidized kind of flavor to it from the barrel aging. Or maybe that's just a coincidence, but that's my head logic anyway. So you sort of start to get, I think, Fino and Manzanilla, really nice wines, light bodied, interesting, crisp. Like if you're a wine drinker, I think you'll appreciate those probably more than someone who's strictly a whiskey drinker. Partly because there's not the vocabulary in your head to really describe these things to yourself, to really latch onto those flavor notes. But you start getting those flavor notes that are more whiskey-like once you start getting into these more oxidized styles.
Well, and oddly enough, for a lot of sake consumers, the Fino and Manzanilla, just the yeasty effect, you'll notice some kind of similarity in flavor profiles just from the play of the yeast. It was certainly something when I started going out for sushi and was consuming sake after I'd kind of been doing sherry for a while. It's like, oh my God, this really reminds me of that umami that you get from sherry when I'm having the sake. Because, the various inoculations yeast that are used in sake are such a profound effect on the larger rice wine you're having, or rice beer, I guess you could say.
So, Phil, what do you think flavor notes wise on the Amontillado? I'm getting, I don't know. I'm having a hard time with the words today, actually. You go ahead and go first.
There is a lot more of the sort of oxidized, like it's less lively and more of a sort of robust. I don't want to say flat because it's not flat in flavor profile, but it doesn't have the like sparkling high notes that, if you picture the flavor spectrum like sound, doesn't have a lot of the like sparkly top notes, and it's starting to fill out at the lower end.
I tend to get a lot of marzipan, but not like bright sweet almonds so much as you think of marzipan, but take the sweetness out. It's just the rest of that kind of baking spice nuttiness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Combined with, again, the hint of the yeasty, because, again, Amontillado's began its life as Fino and Manzanilla. You still have the yeasty play as an undertone underneath all this other fun stuff you're playing with. That's what I tend to get.
I definitely get the, now that you've said it, that marzipan. It's a little different than what I normally get for marzipan in a whiskey, because I'm thinking marzipan needs to be sweet, but in this case, it's a dry wine, so that almondy paste flavor is coming from, or is coming across a little differently.
Yeah, it's almost
but
like almond skins as opposed to like the sweet flesh of the almonds.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I find it interesting that musician types like Phil and myself always fall back on like describing whiskey as a sound spectrum, as like, where are the highs, where are the mids, where are the lows, and how high are they, how low are they, and what we were saying last night. This one feels like it's filled out the middle just a bit more.
Yeah, you're not getting the hi hat or the bass quite so much here, but you're.
Yep. So I'm going to take a quick second to read a comment from Instagram. So Boulder Spirit says, Phil's just sitting back waiting to drop the big hammer questions. And we've just gotten a request from Embellish Podcast. John Hughes has joined in. Thanks for joining. If there's Amontillado, who's reciting the poem tonight? So I think if there was ever a good time for it, now's the time.
I will sort of do an excerpt. The excerpt that I read last night. It was about dusk one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today, but I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" said he. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible! And in the middle of the carnival?" "I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price, without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain." "Amontillado! I have my doubts. Amontillado! And I must satisfy them. Amontillado! As you are engaged. I am on my way to Lucchese. If anyone has a critical tongue, it is he, and he will tell me, Lucchese can't tell Amontillado from sherry." And that's where I will end my my excerpt with the
excellent recitation.
Thank you. With the fun fact that when we read that in high school, I read ahead, as I was wont to do, because I was that awful child in high school, and Googled things. And, of course, in class, "Oh, what's Amontillado? What's sherry?" Well, sherry is raise my hand. Sherry is a type of Amontillado, or Amontillado is a type of sherry. which of course prompted the question of, how do you know that? Which, I Googled it.
John says he started using macarons as my tasting note instead of marzipan because the ingredients are
Yeah.
similar enough and I don't have to wear an ascot to talk about it, which is a funny image. And funny enough for me, since I've made macarons, I think of macarons as a thing that contain marzipan. And actually, as a kid, I grew up eating like marzipan candies covered in chocolate as like a Christmas treat. So for me, marzipan is actually the less hoity-toity thing than the French hard to make French dessert. All right, so moving on just a little bit from the Amontillado, and we'll come back on tasting notes probably as a comparison. But just to spend a minute talking about Palo Cortado, I think as the contrast, for me, I had a hard time placing this immediately as something that was related to Amontillado, related to Oloroso, because as soon as I opened this bottle and stuck my nose in, I was like, oh, there's cocoa and floral notes and like almost hazelnut. And the longer it's been open, actually, it's only been a few days, that floral note is really developed on the nose. And it's a beautiful wine. Depending on the day, might be my favorite.
Yeah.
Oloroso was my first favorite. My first time through all the sherries, Oloroso had the right balance of oxidativeness and this sort of sweet feeling and complexity. But Palo Cortado, depending on the day, really just kills it with the complexity, and that works for me.
Well, and they're of all the dry sherries, they're probably the two most like each other in kind of the flavor profile. The main differentiation being, well, the fact that the Palo Cortado is made with the first pressing in the grape, whereas the Oloroso is the second pressing. So you're already dealing with a different wine in terms of just like tannic exposure and just the robustness of the wine itself. So Palo Cortado's, by virtue of being the first pressing, is going to have a little more delicacy to it. And then it's a question of what is the split on the aging between biologic versus oxidative, because some Palo Cortados, there's very little biological aging. We're talking just a couple months or maybe a year or two. And then most of it's oxidatively aged, much like an Oloroso. So they're very, very similar, more so than all the other wines in terms of their what they have in common, their commonalities.
Interesting. What do you think, Phil?
In comparison between the Palo Cortado and the Amontillado, I think particularly this Palo Cortado has a little bit more of the like leathery, rich, lower pitch, broader flavors than the Amontillado, and a little bit less of the like bready, yeasty notes.
And is that supported in the aging? It's more oxidatively aged than
yeah. Which a nerdy side note that I'm going to get into. So Palo Cortado, its name, what it comes from, the translation is broken stick. The reason why that exists is you can see with the hieroglyphic here is on the barrels with the Fino and Manzanilla. Essentially, that's the stick. And when they realized it was no longer going to be a Fino or Manzanilla, the line is drawn through it with a Palo Cortado, so they know that it's no longer going to be a Fino or Manzanilla, and now it's a Palo Cortado. But that's just me being nerdy.
I actually really liked that when I looked that up when I stumbled across that, I wasn't looking it up. When I stumbled across that, I was like, oh, now I get the name. And I don't really know much Spanish, so I figured that it was something about maybe who made it, like it was named after a person or something like that.
Yeah, Bob Cortado.
Yeah. I saw a post on Instagram earlier today where somebody had visited a development crop of barley and found a varietal barley that was just labeled Greg.
Yeah, I found out earlier this year German chocolate cakes, which are historically probably my favorite dessert, that they're not called that because they're from Germany. The guy who invented the cake, his last name was German.
And he was an Englishman.
Yeah, like Sam German, and so he invented the cake, and now they're German chocolate cakes.
Well, so was the English monarch, you know.
Yeah.
There's that.
Okay, so one last for tasting notes out of what we've tasted so far. So we get to the Oloroso, and you were saying Oloroso is a second pressing,
Yeah.
and also entirely oxidatively aged.
Yes.
Okay, so this is quite different from everything that we've had so far. So second press. My initial reaction to that is this basically a pumice wine as a sort of a starting point?
No, you'll see in productions, as I like to mention, is you'll generally see like 3 to 4 pressing to the wines. It's usually like the third or fourth pressing that you'll start to see like Pomash brandies, like grappa. That's where the skin contact and the seed contact and the stem contact becomes much more pronounced. The secondary pressing is pretty common. I mean, for most winemakers, their signature wines are going to be the first pressing, and then their table wines will be the second pressing.
Okay.
It's pretty common for the secondary pressing for that to be used for winemaking. It doesn't as often, isn't their showcase wine. Sherry is different in that regard, in that, like, yes, we do want this secondary wine. It's just we need something with backbone to stand up to, a heavy lamb or pork or beef, something with some spice to it. In fact, in one of our brochures, which I wish I had grabbed, it shows flavor wheels and what different styles of cuisines pair well with different wines. And Oloroso, just by virtue of that big heft to it, which it gets from being the second pressing, can really stand up to some fun, super spicy stuff, or things with a lot of gamey flavor to it.
There is a recipe in my grandmother's cookbook that has scribbled at the side "not fino" for a lamb roast with like rosemary and various other things and sherry, and then scribbled "not fino," and that was for a long time just the extent of my knowledge about sherry. Was apparently you don't want fino for that.
Yeah, and that's definitely. I mean, you find that in old cocktail manuals too, or it calls for dry sherry or dry vermouth or sweet vermouth, but it doesn't necessarily specify the origin or what style we're talking about, because a lot of people think, oh, it's entirely interchangeable. It's like, no, it's really not. You wouldn't take apples and then put in rhubarb.
Yeah. Or even pears.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I want to come back to the Oloroso later, because last night Phil and I discovered some interesting comparisons on flavor notes when we actually got into the sweeter styles, which was ironic, and working our way backwards was kind of fun. So,
and that's fine. I mean, I would jump next to actually the Pedro Jimenez, which this is going to be the first time we're using a different grape, as you guys will see with your glasses in the light, that there's a syrupy kind of coating thing to this. So even the production of Pedro Jimenez sherry is different from the 5 sherries we've just tried, in that the previous 5, it's fermented to completion. All the sugar is converted into alcohol. In the case of Pedro Jimenez, fermentation's arrested about halfway in. They up the alcohol content, kill off all the yeast that are fermenting, and you're resulting in a much sweeter style of wine, because there's still a ton of sugar in there. There's actually twice as much sugar as your typical glass of wine. I think the Brix level of the typical glass, I want to say, is like 40, and this is an 80 on the Brix. And also in the production, when they're harvesting the grapes, they take after they've harvested the grapes, they then lay them out on straw mats in the sand and allow them to dry out for a couple of days prior to turning them to wine. So you kind of, I don't want to, before we've had a chance to think about the taste of this wine, you get a very raisinish quality, because you're essentially making a wine out of raisins just by concentrating the sugars, reducing the amount of moisture in the grape itself. So it's much more sugar per drop of water.
Yeah, my research last night said that it was 300 to 400 grams per liter of sugar, which basically makes this simple syrup level sweetness.
Yeah, it's
And
so much
I
sugar
mean,
that the yeast that turn it into alcohol actually have too much food. A lot of
yeah,
times
just
the
looking at
yeast
how
will,
it moves, right? You can
yeah,
see how syrupy that is, and it coats the glass. And then, of course, it is molasses colored, right? This is, you can't see through it even, and this is the tiniest, just little. For one, like I usually pour half an ounce. I poured less than half an ounce of this because uh, it's so. As you said earlier, this can be quite cloying.
yeah.
If you're having it just by itself.
Yeah, most of these wines you want to chill them at cellar temperature, but traditionally PX or Pedro Jimenez, they'll often make it in the slightly colder part of the cellar, just because the coldness uh, essentially just dampens your ability to taste things, so it cuts down a little bit on the cloying nature of this. But you'll traditionally pour it in a much smaller glass. It's not like a wine glass pour like the previous five. This is much smaller glass, but you pair it with desserts, like churros
Right.
and chocolate. This is actually a beautiful pairing with churros and chocolate.
Yep. So that's a great time to mention. So I do have something that looks kind of like a Capita, but it's also Glencairn on a stick.
Yeah.
I would be using these, except that I only have 6 of them, and I only have one proper Capita. So I decided to just sort of compromise and do everything in Glencairns, which I have are
A lot
ubiquitous in
of,
my
yeah.
household. I have a lot. I have 24 ish, and then some. So that's why I'm drinking out of Glencairns. This is not the proper glassware, so to speak, but it's going to serve pretty much the same purpose in that it's tulip shaped, it's wider on the bowl, narrower on the top. So I would
Yeah.
say anybody who wants to get into sherry, if you don't have a sherry glass, that's okay.
It's actually
Don't let that stop you.
traditionally sherry is served in wine glasses, anyways, for most sherry. So if you have wine glasses around the house, they work wonderfully. So you don't have to get specialty glassware, except for the Pedro Jimenez. You might want to get smaller glasses just because you're not doing a
Yep.
full pour.
My Baijiu glasses might be a little too small though, although it probably would still work.
I mean, considering the amount of Baijiu you want to drink, that's probably the right size too. So
Yeah, I think it holds about 3 to 5 milliliters in the
yeah,
tiny
that's probably about
the
spot
multi
on.
glass. Yeah.
Here we go.
Oh yeah, that'll work. Oh yeah, that's another fun one. So shout out to Thumper in the Whiskey Lodge who has turned these tiny Glencairns out of borosilicate glass, I believe, the
Yeah.
equivalent of Pyrex. So they're pricey little trinkets, but they're so cute. Yeah. So
This
yeah, go ahead if you've got.
it's like, if you remember as a child, there was the fruit leather snacks that was like
Yep.
whole fruit
Yeah.
mushed up, laid flat, dried out. This is like a liquid version of that.
Yeah.
Yep. It also has it's surprisingly floral considering how dark it is. It's got some nice almost like I'm seeing like purple flowers kind of, but I don't really know what they're
Yeah.
called. Maybe like lilacs or something like that. I'm probably using the wrong flower name. I need to go learn my flowers better because those are tasting notes that escape me most of the time. But there's definitely something floral about this, and that raisiness really brings down to that deep mid to low palate sound notes wise, right? Like it fills out the
Yeah.
mid and the low palate.
There's definitely some bass notes. They're bright bass notes. It's like
Sort of brassy, like a tuba, as opposed to like an electronic or
yeah, it's like
a
a kick
string
drum or
bass.
something along those lines. Yeah, even like a French horn, which is just playing a low note.
Yep. Great. I'm a musician. I play an orchestra. I've got a concert this weekend. Great stuff. French horns when beautiful are so beautiful.
My older
Phil is a brass
sibling,
player. I'm a string player.
yeah, my older sibling is actually a French horn player, and when they were starting, my dad likened the noises they were making to someone strangling a moose.
All right. Yeah, PX, my wife's favorite by far.
Yeah.
I think that it's one of my favorites conditionally. It's very sweet, so I need to be having it with
Yeah, it's
something that's
often
an appropriate
the
compliment.
gateway with sherry. I'm a huge fan of port and Madeiras. And port and sherry, the Pedro Jimenez sherry, share some similar production processes in terms of arresting the fermentation. So there's a lot of leftover residual sugars in the wine when it's then converted. So for a lot of people who are maybe, familiar with port, PX can be a good gateway to this is where you start. The challenge you run into with sherry is people assume that most sherries are like PX, or the next one we're going to try, which is cream sherry. And as where we started, it could not be further from the truth.
Also, you didn't really spoil us on the tasting notes for PX because whiskey drinkers, if they know any sherry, they know about PX sherry. That's one of the only ones that tends to get a lot of label presence if it's in there. And people are essentially told to expect that it's going to taste like prunes, raisins, that sort of thing. So that's how you can tell there's sherry in it. But again, there's so many kinds of sherry that's not always true.
Yeah, and I've definitely come across sherries where it just says, sherry-cask, and it doesn't have any of those prunes, which, the reason why PX works so beautifully is all the baking spice notes you get from the cask. It's a natural slide right in of prunes with baking spices. Of course, this is going to play well together.
All right, so next up we have the cream sherry, and
so I'm going to jump in with the Lustau East India Solera, which is a cream sherry. Yes.
Yep. Which I grabbed this one because I was tickled partly that this looks the styling of the label on this one looks so much like
port bottles.
That also Madeira often has brandings like this.
And there's going to be some similarity. The huge difference between sherry and Madeira being obviously grapes, but also Madeira tends to be a mixture of sweeter and drier wine styles as opposed to sherry, where it's either a dry sherry or it's a sweet sherry, and then cream is the blend between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, this is an 80-20 blend between Oloroso and Pedro Jimenez. What differentiates this particular style of sherry, it is not exclusive to Lustau in that only we make this, or only we can make this style. Any sherry producer can make the style. We're just the only ones that continue to do so. What's different about this sherry is most cream sherries, they're blended when they're bottled. In the case of this particular sherry, it's blended and then it's aged an additional 3 years in its own Solera system in the sacristy, which is the hottest part of the bodega, to capture the aging effects of when it was shipped in casks on wooden boats sailing to the East Indies. And so you'd have the wide temperature variation, very hot days as you're kind of traveling through the equator or equatorial waters, and then cold nights. And so this is meant to recreate that aging process. So it is still a cream sherry. It's just a very specific style of cream sherry. But
I found it interesting. I clearly was looking at both labels when I was perusing the shelf for things that I didn't have. At first, I thought this might actually be a different kind of sherry because you'd mentioned 8. I had 7 at the time. I didn't realize that. I'm sorry. I always troubling remembering the one that starts with an M.
Muscatel?
Muscatel. Thank you. Yes. So I didn't know that Muscatel was a sherry. Actually, I knew the name of that wine thanks to a specific whiskey finish, which happens to be one of my favorite bourbons from Woodinville Whiskey. That has a Muscatel finish from, I think it was 2021 harvest release.
Well, and I want to do a quick kind of sidebar. In Muscat grapes, they make wines with Muscat. It's the same grape. So there are a lot of Muscatels and Muscat that are just wines. This happens to be a sherry made with the Muscat or Muscatel grapes. So before I create any sort of confusion there is both the wine Muscatel and then the sherry wine Muscatel.
Good to know. Good clarification. Yeah. So when I was looking at this label, I looked on the back and I said, oh, okay. So this says it's a cream sherry, right? East India Solera cream. And that only appears on the back label. And I was wondering why, because as far as I understand, cream is a particular style of sherry, but in further research, it seems cream can refer to a level of sweetness as well.
Yeah, well, the word cream sherry itself is actually an English marketing term. Prior to, I think, the 18th or 19th century, the Spanish had their own name for the style of sherry. I think it was Amoroso. It was only by virtue of there was a style of kind of rot gut fortified wine called Bristol Milk. That was very popular in the shipping town of Bristol in England, which sidebar, a lot of sherry companies have English names because during the Napoleonic Wars, England was in Spain a lot fighting Napoleon. Well, they found this wonderful sherry wine, and so they started companies to export it back to England. So this Bristol Milk was popular, and Harvey's, the company, wanted to differentiate the quality of their product, them being based in Bristol. And they say, well, if you guys are drinking the Bristol Milk, we have the Harvey's Bristol Cream, which is the best stuff. And that caught on. And so you had this wild request to Spain of like, give us more of this cream sherry. We want this cream sherry. And the Spanish like, we don't know what you're talking about. Oh, it's this Amoroso. Yeah, sure. We'll call it cream sherry so you know what it is so you can go buy it. And so that caught on, this style of blended sherries. They'd been doing it for a while, but it had other names. And so that's where the expression cream sherry came from. But it was still kind of for a long time, especially, again, because you have both the Malaga and Montilla regions and a couple of the regions that make a similar wine. So you'll see, like, I think dry sack sherry. You'll see a lot of these things that are trying to glom on to the name sherry just because it was indicative of a certain quality of fortified wine, which is how, obviously AOC's developed, is because maybe lower quality producers were trying to jump on the marketing for this term. And so there's still some confusion that would come up with, cream sherry versus non-cream sherries, where historically speaking, and now with the Consejo Regulador, the regulating agency for sherry, it's like, this is what cream sherry is. But there still is some confusion out there, historically speaking.
Okay, so there's one related term that now feels like a good time to ask about, which is medium. So I have a sherry that's labeled Amontillado medium.
Yeah.
I've also read that medium, like cream, is an indication of level of sweetness.
Yes, it's also generally a medium sherry. So you'll see medium golden. That's indicative of cream sherry, where Amontillado or Palo generally Amontillado just for a sheer amount of production, that's what you have to play with. That's the base spirit or the base dry sherry in your cream sherry. And then it's like rich medium. I mean, there can be a lot of differentiation, but that's just indicative of it's probably a cream sherry made with Amontillado. So it's going to have a little bit of Pedro Jimenez or maybe some Muscatel. It gets a little not subjective, a little gray area with some of these cream sherries, because sometimes the producer they generally add Pedro Jimenez just because that's the most in production, but sometimes they'll add a little Muscatel to round it out. Just they do create a slightly different flavor profile, but them both being different grapes.
Okay, so the Almacenista Amontillado from Lustau is not blended with another type, correct?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay. So, the interesting thing about this one, when I was comparing this to the Amontillado medium that I have, is that, okay, sure, that one's like a touch sweeter, but mostly they're really in the same ballpark of sweetness, such that was actually surprising to learn that it might have some sweeter sherry blended into it.
Yeah.
But okay, good to know. So, I think at this point we've covered all of the styles of sherry that we have available to us tonight. So now might be a great time to start talking a little bit more about how sherry impacts whiskey, right?
Yeah.
What whiskey drinkers should know about sherry and sherry casks. So first of all, I guess just to speak in broad terms, so whiskey, like the fact that it's been aged in sherry is basically a marketing term that's used quite a lot, especially in Scotch single malts.
Yeah.
As you said, they'll just say sherry cask. Great. We don't know what kind of sherry that was. I think there's a lot of I've done a lot of haphazard research here and there about like what sherry really, like what whiskey, what types of sherry casks whiskey is really aged in, and is it even the styles of sherry that you would bottle for drinking? And the answer to that seems to be mostly no. And I think probably is a good segue into that, a good first place to start before we get into whiskey. Whiskey nerds care about age. So we haven't really talked about age too much with the sherries that we have. But if you could just give us a brief rundown on like what the typical ages are for sherry.
Ooh, I mean, it's part of the challenge is that it's with Solera aging. Because it's a mixture of wines through the Solera system. When you say an age, you're getting like a rough approximation based on averages.
Yep.
So you're usually looking around 10 to 12 years, depending on the style. Like Finos and Manzanillas, you're usually looking around 8. Amontillado Palo maybe 10 to 12. Oloroso's a little older. There are vintage sherries, VOR and VORS, which is Latin for like Vinum Optimum Reginum Significum, where they legally have to establish that even the youngest drop of sherry in that bottle is X number of years. So you'll see some 30 to 40 to 50-year-old Pedro Jimenez or Oloroso. You won't see it so much with the Manzanillas or Finos because, as I mentioned earlier, the yeast only lasts so long. Although they do have older Amontillados and, Finos and Manzanillas, which I think it's called Posada, where it's like an inverted Palo Cortado, where you have the vast majority is biological aging and then the remainder is oxidatively aged. But yeah, you're usually looking at 10 to 12 years in terms of the age of the sherry. Now, in terms of the casks themselves that the whiskey is then aged in, sherry casks, or the cask that the whiskey is being aged in, up until the 1980s, when sherry was shipped to England, because England being one of the larger markets for sherry, they shipped it in wooden barrels. So most of the sherry cask aging, historically speaking, came from those extra barrels lying around. I mean, it wasn't economically feasible to ship them back to Spain, so they basically were shipped to England, and then if anybody wants them, they can have them. And the Scots, being a very thrifty people, would use those sherry casks. So the sherry that was in those barrels was very much sherry that was used for bottling. It was just rebottled when it arrived in England for people to, buy at the local store. But they differentiate from the cask that sherry is aged in. I don't know if that's where you're trying to lead me to have that discussion.
Yeah, a bit. So I guess my perception right now, and I'm sure that this is overly narrow, is that there's basically 3 kinds of sherry casks. There's Solera bodega sherry casks, so to speak, which is actually used for aging the sherry that becomes drinking sherry. Then there's transport casks, which were used to transport the sherry from Spain to wherever on boats, right? Typically, I think they don't really use transport casks anymore.
No.
For one thing, I believe the reason for that is that sherry now has to be bottled in Spain.
That I'm not entirely sure. I know how it has to be transported. It has to be either in casks or in bottles. That only comes up because there's a lot of sherry producers that would like to put sherry in like beer kegs, so you could have you can attach it to a draft system. Yeah, but legally, if once it goes into a beer keg, it's no longer considered sherry anymore. Which, on the one hand, I get it. The regulator, they want to have a consistent flavor profile for every one of the products, and if you're putting it from a bottle into a steel keg, maybe somehow you're going to affect the flavor. I think it just takes kind of the fun out of the thing. And rising tides, let's just get people to drink more sherry.
Right.
But turns out they're not calling me to ask for my opinion on this sort of thing. So,
well, it should be. I want that rising tide. Sherry is a wonderful wine. I want, like, there's a few takeaways that I want to keep saying as far as anybody who's a whiskey nerd who's listening into this, what you should know about sherry. Sherry is a lovely wine. You should drink it. And you should drink it because it's a lovely wine, but you should also drink it because you like sherried whiskey. And somebody has to be making that sherry in order for there to be sherry for you to enjoy whiskey made from. So definitely, drink more sherry, right? And
please.
Yeah, I don't know about you. I think whiskey is actually really hard to pair with food because whiskey tends to overpower other flavors. Sometimes if you're having like a strong cheese or something like that, like there are pairings that work for whiskey, but by and large, whiskey is something that you sip as a digestive or as just an evening activity or something like that, where that's the only thing you're drinking, or you drink it while you're grilling, like before you eat dinner. So it's more of an aperitif or something like that. Not something that you really pair with food. Sherry, like most fortified wines, is a little bit stronger. So whiskey drinkers are going to be on board with that. But it also is not so strong to overpower food. So it really works as a food pairing.
Yeah, very much so. Although I've always been a big proponent of drinking the thing that is produced in the same area as food. So I imagine Scotch probably pairs well with Scotch eggs and bangers and mash and haggis. But
That's
not
a
all
good
of us
point.
want to. Not all of us want to have that on our daily menu.
Haggis has a reputation, but I am here to say that I have consumed enough haggis on special occasions to say that much of its reputation is unearned.
Yeah. Well, I live in the Ballard area of Seattle, and so there's a lot of that with lutefisk. Which,
Yes.
Yeah.
Bad lutefisk could raise the dead or put them
Yeah.
back.
At least peel the paint off your car.
Yep. Okay, so there's bodega casks, there's transport casks, and then there's sherry seasoned casks that are made specifically for aging whiskey.
And essentially, they're just kind of recreating the experience of the shipping casks. I mean, they turn over really wet casks to the whiskey producers to recapture that same expression. I mean, the difference with the sherry aging casks in the bodega, the whole process for that is it usually takes about 50 to 60 years of seasoning, where they're putting essentially, it's sherry, but it's sherry they're probably not going to sell the average consumer. I mean, it's sherry just to essentially coat the cask, allow the tannins to interact with the sherry until they're basically coating the cask with sherry for 50 to 60 years, so it completely neutralizes anything that could possibly affect the flavor of the sherry. Because all they want that cask for is just to be a vessel to hold the wine and allow it to age, be it biologically or oxidatively. And they'll hold on to those casks until they're flinders, until they're splinters. I mean, there's quite often you'll find casks that are 100, 200 years old. And so if it becomes a situation, the only time where the sherry bodegas are selling off those aging casks are when the sherry the producer is closing its doors for the final time. And so that's, quite frankly, kind of a tragedy, is when you have to sell off the sherry casks, just because so much work goes into getting them ready to make sherry with them, or age sherry with them. And you can essentially get the same experience, if not better, using those quasi shipping casks where you've just basically painted them with sherry to get that same experience, because the sherry aging casks in the bodega they're entirely non-reactive. So and plus they're also 600-liter casks, so that's a pretty large cask where you're only getting so much exposure to the liquid inside, to the cask itself. So, bang for your buck in terms of cask exposure to the aging stuff. It just doesn't work as well as the average whiskey cask ager would want. I mean, it would make much more sense just because the shipping casks are smaller. You get a lot more cask exposure for the Ushkabaha, as it were.
Yep. Okay, so the sherry seasoned casks they're making today are to replicate that experience of the transport casks, which there were some months involved in that journey by sea, surely.
Yeah.
But besides that, that makes sense. You don't use the transport casks anymore as much, so you're gonna need something to replace that. And of course, using sherry casks to age Scotch whiskey, at least, is essentially a tradition by the time that transport casks stopped being used. So it makes sense that there's a market for that. And hopefully the sherry market doesn't collapse, but even if it does, I think it's relatively less expensive to create those sherry seasoned casks for whiskey.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of sherry houses and Scotch houses that have formed partnerships with each other to make sure that there's at least a consistent supply of juice going to them, so they can continue to produce that flavor profile that many whiskies. I mean, there's obviously Scotches like Glenfarclas, which I think most of its time aging is done in sherry casks.
Almost all of it.
Yeah, so you get that consistent aging flavor profile I mean, more than anything else, I mean, don't get me wrong. We all love the single cask or small batch or single barrel or what have you, but there's a lot of times where you've had a long day at work or a long week at work. You want to have the house expression just to kind of round out your day. And so you want that consistent flavor profile time over time over time. I don't need to have to think about what I'm drinking. I want to have something that I know is going to be good and is going to be consistent. So the sherry houses and scotch houses have formed partnerships to at least keep that opportunity alive.
Right.
We just need to talk people to. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say we need to talk people into drinking more sherry so that the partnership is just a little side hustle as opposed to the main thing of what's going on with sherry producers.
Yes, 100% agree with that. And I hope that everyone watching and everyone who will watch this video takes away from this. Sherry is great wine. You should drink it. Go tell your local wine store that you want to see Spanish sherry in their store. That was one of the problems I actually came up when I was looking for sherry. You ask, local liquor and wine store, right? They'll say, where wines and liquors, or liquors and wines and that sort of thing. And you go in there and you say, hey, even West Seattle, which has a great selection of spirits, their wine section was utterly lacking in sherry. And what sherry they had was California sherry. And my local wine shop also, it was all California sherry. And actually, as far as cream sherry goes, this cream sherry blew my mind, because my experience with cream sherry before this has been the California cream sherry, because that's, Mom told me buy cream sherry for cooking with, right? That was just the rule of thumb in the family. It's a mix of sweet and dry, and you're gonna cook with it. So that old thing where it's like, well, you're gonna cook with it, you're gonna cover it up with other flavors, so don't worry about it so much. And I don't agree with that anymore. I'm more in the camp of you shouldn't cook with wine that you wouldn't drink, because you will taste it in your food, absolutely. And so I've moved on now to feeling like this really, really good sherry, California cream sherry, I don't want to say it's bad, but Phil and I basically agreed that something was off about that bottle.
Well, and what can be especially fun too is I had to pick up a bottle at my local wine shop, and it was like, I'm not going to name the large wine shop that it was, but it's a local large wine shop, and all of the sherry was in the dessert wine category, which well and fine with your cream sherries and your Pedro Jimenez and Muscatels, but those first 5 sherries, if I was a local consumer just wanting to get a bottle of wine and I picked up a Manzanilla expecting a dessert wine, I'm going to be very disappointed, which is in no way a reflection on the quality of the Manzanilla, but it's not a dessert wine by any stretch of the imagination.
Ian has finally shown up in the chat, and his first comment is LMAO California cream sherry. Yeah. Thank you, Ian.
But even worse, at one of the local grocery stores, I was in the sherry section, and in the cream sherry section, they had 3 bottles of Irish whiskey cream, which that's not even the same category, and yet there was so little care or thought put into it that of course you're going to have Bailey's right next to East India Solera.
Mm-hmm. Well,
that's
a little strange.
So one of the difficulties that I had was I live in an area that is fairly affluent. There are a number of very high-end wine shops around me, most of whom don't have a website, so it's hard to get a hold of them and see what they have. The only one that I managed to get a reply from who had sherry is the one wine store that I don't feel like I could afford to walk into. and that's sort of one of those, like, if the only place where you can find anything beyond a cream sherry is a place that feels unwelcoming, it's going to be detrimental to the general populace looking for that sherry. And it isn't anything that Lustau can really do much about. It's on consumers putting pressure on retailers to carry, a broader variety to have a better selection of options.
Yeah. I mean, I like to describe it for a lot of people. It's kind of like corn chips. I mean, you can find Frito-Lay's Doritos Cool Ranch at every grocery store you walk into. But if you're looking for some sort of single varietal especially blue corn chip, like maybe it's a non-GMO something, like it's certainly available in the market to sell it to you, but the average grocery store is not going to stock it if no one's going to buy it. I mean, that shelf space is important to them. But if you have a local wine store or grocery store or somewhere that sells wines, I mean, and they are staffed by someone who, cares about what they do. And I mean, we find this in every community, is somebody who actually puts some thought into it. If you could develop a relationship with your wine purveyor, I mean, they could certainly start carrying a lot of these wines. And sherry, with the exception of the really old vintage sherries I was telling you about, most sherries are actually pretty reasonably priced. I mean, you're talking the $20 to $30 range, depending on the style. Most of them tend to hover around $20. I mean, it's not hard to get a pretty good bottle of sherry for not a ton of money.
That was exactly, yeah, go ahead.
The catch is the only reason that this very high-end wine shop carries sherry is because the customers that they serve are also looking for sherry. It's one of those, they do all of their wine shopping in one place, and it's that wine shop.
Yeah.
And
yeah, some of it is it's a demand bias, right? Like if you've got a really small shop and sherry doesn't do much volume, and honestly it doesn't, you're not as likely to find as many options in sherry in a small wine shop as if you go to the biggest wine shop in town, which ironically I didn't want to have to end up going to the big chain. I like supporting local business. Everybody knows that about me, right? I would rather go to the local wine shop. I'd rather go to the small mom and pop owned store and support them. And there's a lot of good ones in the area. But none of them carried the sherry, unfortunately. The ones that I tried, I've asked around, so I'm going to have some more options to explore. But when I finally found that Palo Cortado, it was actually in the biggest Total Wine that I know of. Right, which happened, and also in the most affluent area. The Bellevue Total Wine is where I found the Palo Cortado. Nobody else had it.
Yeah. And that's just unfortunate that for a lot of sherry, it's kind of requires some advanced planning where you just have to contact your local wine purveyor and say, hey, can you special order this for me? And obviously, if you're doing it enough times, they'll start to just carry it on the shelves. I mean, that's also, excuse me, nominally part of my job is to encourage people to go out and buy this stuff so they can find it through the local grocery stores. I'm pretty fortunate in that, also in the Seattle area, like you, Doug, that a number of the grocery chains like Metropolitan Market and Town and Country tend to have some well-curated wine selections. Although the fortified wine category tends to be a little overloaded with port, which, don't get me wrong, I love port. Port's a wonderful wine, and it has its own challenges that it's dealing with, much like ours in the sherry world. But your average fortified wine category tends to be, it's like IPAs with beer, where it's all port, and then you have a couple, Marsalas and Rancios and sherries, just kind of basically picking up the remainder.
Yep. So the question I was going to ask earlier is sort of getting to the elephant in the room, I guess, is that Lustau is probably one of the biggest names in sherry for whiskey drinkers.
Mm-hmm.
Because among other things, your brand name is actually on the Redbreast PX.
It is, yes. Yeah, we have a partnership with them.
Yeah, so when people are looking for a sherry brand, if they're familiar with the sort of, and Redbreast is one of those introductory recommended whiskeys to try, right? It's not a single malt, but it's a good high quality Irish whiskey that gives you a little something extra. Yeah. And so that's going to be the first place where people start to see brand name sherry, right? As opposed to going into the store and saying, I have no idea what this is, but I've heard of Lustau, right? You're on a whiskey that I like. So of course I'm going to try, like if I'm going to go buy a bottle of whiskey, if I'm going to go buy a bottle of sherry, then that's going to be probably one of the first places that I look. So like kudos to you. I guess my question is, why is it that sherry brands don't seem to be called out as much on sherry cask aging of whiskey?
I mean, that's a good question. Some of it is a function of much like, blends and whiskey blends where you have smaller houses that all they do is provide for the blends. They don't necessarily bottle their own stuff. A lot of the sherry cask aging you see are just the company merely exists to provide sherry cask aging. I mean, that's all they do. And again, that gets back to the demand. I mean, Lustau, we certainly punch them up our weight because we're a small company. Because we again have so many different expressions that we bottle, as well as some of the partnerships we work with, it gives the impression of us just being this massive company that is the biggest game in town, and that could not be further from the truth. There are a number of share companies that are you know um, exponentially bigger than we are, decimal points bigger in terms of the production they do. They just happen to do, maybe only one or two expressions like they do Manzanilla and Amontillado or Fino and Amontillado kind of thing, as opposed to all the expressions we do where we have a bodega in all three of the towns of the Sherry Triangle. Some of it's that. Some of it, I think, quite honestly, is just the cachet. I mean, it's hard to impress people with a company they've never heard of.
Mhm.
Like, oh wow, it's the random name, Spanish name sherry. I just need to know that it's sherry cask aged. I don't need to know who this sherry producer is I've never heard from before. I mean, fortunately for us, our name is big enough that it actually has an association with quality. And so that people know that if this something has been aged in Lustau casks, that it is a good sherry, that I know I'm going to get a good quality. And also, like you said, Redbreast is such a good Irish whiskey. It's a great partnership, and that we were both benefiting each other to show that, yeah, we're this good quality sherry producer is working with this quality Irish whiskey producer to turn out a really lovely whiskey expression. So I think it has as much to do with both of those factors, where it's either a house that's all they do is produce sherry for cask aging, and then also just the lack of name recognition. There's just no benefit to throwing in some of those, sherry bodega names.
That is one of those things that there has been a push in the last several years towards transparency with distilleries and how they're aging and it goes as granular, if you'll pardon the word usage, as where the grain is grown to the type of barrel that they're using. And there are nerds in the whiskey community, such as myself, admittedly, that would love to be able to see, on the label, oh, this sort of sherry from this bodega was used, and then go and look up that bodega and learn about the bodega and the style of sherry that they produce. But
Well, and some of it is also a factor of capacity. I mean, this is a discussion I've certainly got into with bourbon drinkers. Is like they don't talk about where the bourbon is sourced. They talk about when it gets to the aging facility and how where the rack house and all that other stuff. But if you're, Black Maple Hill is a perfect example where they used to source their bourbon from one company and now they source it from another company. They're not necessarily going to talk about where they sourced it from. And sherry producers, just having only so much capacity, the whiskey producers may have to switch partners on a regular basis. And so not having to go through the expense of changing the bottling name or labeling, especially if you have to go through the TTB, which that is a nightmare of a process. That a lot of times they're not going to go into where it comes from, as long as it's a quality producer and you're getting a consistent product. They don't want to necessarily have to, unless they know they can consistently get it from that same producer year over year over year, which is again why we can make that partnership with Lustau, is because hopefully we have enough of a foothold and demand that we'll be around long enough that we can keep that on the bottle.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we're getting close to 2 hours, so I want to ask this question that we had from Instagram. So a question from Lucky Old Cask on Instagram is curious about the randomness of which sherry barrels impart sulfur, the impact that that flavoring has on the industry and processes to mitigate use of sulfurized casks in the future, and consumer confidence in sherry finished single barrel products. If you have any opinions on those topics, I and many others would love to hear your takes.
Okay, start.
That was kind of a dense question. So
Yeah, I mean, there was a period of time when sulfur was used as a preservative in the cask itself, and that was translated over into obviously potentially the product that was going through it. That was discontinued a while back, and so I mean, the challenge you run into, as I mentioned, a lot of these casks we're dealing with are hundreds of years old. So even though they're no longer using the sulfur, it still kind of plays around on the cask, but that is not really a factor. It hasn't been for some decades now. I mean, I don't know how much more I could speak to on that other than it was something that happened at one time, but no longer happens. We just, because a lot of the casks are old.
Mhm.
I will say that most of my, almost entirely based on reading, most of my like seeing people talking about particularly sulfury, sherry casks in terms of whiskey aging are on very old bottles like Port Ellen and particularly Brora and Clenleash from prior to their closings, where people are looking at vintage Scotch whiskies, and those are entirely different beasts, both in terms of the style, the way sherry casks were used, the sort of sherry casks that were used, and the style of whiskey that was produced as a result. And so it's sort of an apples and oranges comparison, I, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think another thing to note is that there's a lot of distilleries like Springbank that use worm tub condensers, and to some extent direct firing also may have an impact on that sulfury character of the spirit. So that maybe that sulfur, right, and Springbank, for example, uses sherry casks as one of its core styles. So it could be that you're actually getting a sulfury spirit that happens to have been aged in a sherry cask that maybe the sulfur was already there. Could also be a factor. Because I mean, out of all these sherries, I'm not really detecting any sulfur, right?
Yeah.
No.
I think most of the time when I get a sherried whiskey, I get a meatiness, if anything, and I think that's coming from just filling out that mid palate with so much more richness than a non-sherry cask aged whiskey might
And
have.
some nice nuttiness and round warmth, and there are elements that are hard to describe. There are, when you're looking at sherry, what sort of transfers from the cask to the spirit varies based on the type of cask, whether it was well seasoned or not, and the how well the spirit takes the finish. I have examples of whiskey that I won't actually indicate because you can't see them, that just didn't take their finish very well, not very strongly, or the finish was overwhelming on them. So everything is a balancing act.
Yeah.
And sherry tends to impart, a warmth, a nuttiness, if it's Oloroso, and that nice leathery, um, like old library sort of flavors that like you get on Glenfarclas and other sherry aged whiskeys.
And I mean, some of it is just how the flavors play against each other. I mean, sometimes they're in direct competition with each other. Sometimes they, work beautifully together. Like I was saying with, the Pedro Jimenez, that raisiny flavor working very well with the baking spices, as opposed to like the dry umami. You don't see a lot of casks that are using manzanilla and fino, just because it's like almost sucking the moisture out of your palate, and then that green apple bitiness on top of it doesn't necessarily play as well against like the light cereal nuttiness of your average malted barley whiskey. So it is very much a flavor or a question of how these flavors work with each other. Sometimes the flavors are so similar they're technically there, but because of the level of similarity, you're tasting just the one thing that's actually two separate flavors working together as opposed to the two flavors individually.
We're okay. Sorry, I just knocked over a watch glass. It's one of these, right? Capping my glasses. because I was trying to make room on my desk so that we could talk about a couple of specific whiskeys. Now, longtime watchers will know we are fans of McCarthy's around here. So we were talking a lot about how most sherry cask whiskeys don't actually indicate what type of sherry it was or what brand. Now, this is also this happens to be Casknolia casks. So, I mean, there is a brand there. I don't know that the label actually says it, but that is a true thing. And so the McCarthy's 6-year series has 2 sherry cask finished whiskeys. One of them is the PX. This was the first one to come out, and the other one was the Oloroso cask. So PX and Oloroso being the most common of the sherry cask, the named sherry cask styles.
Well, actually, in just sheer production, they're pretty common because it's all Oloroso is exclusively all that second pressing, and then Pedro Jimenez is all just the Pedro Jimenez grapes for sherry. So there's just there is as much Oloroso and PX in production as almost all the other styles put together. So there's just more to play with in terms of you want to do sherry cask finishes. On top of the fact that both of those styles work very well in pairing with whiskey from the flavor profile standpoint. So it's kind of a meeting of two good things that do well together.
Yeah, I think they're definitely complementary across the whole spectrum of whiskey. And McCarthy's is a heavily peated whiskey, and is a great example of a heavily peated whiskey that is a strong flavor, and the PX sherry, which is a strong flavor, that are playing really well off of each other. In general, I really like peated whiskey that's finished in sweet wine casks. So this is 100% right up my alley. There are, of course, sherry bombs that only taste like sherry, right? It's essentially super high proof sherry, 50-60% sherry, right? Like Glenfarclas might be one of those, depending on your impression of them. Glendronach 15, nice sherry bomb.
Yeah, some of the Glenmorangies.
I was going to say the thing to bear in mind is we've gone from between 15 to 18%. I think one of these is 20% to the Pedro Jimenez cask finished McCarthy's is 56.13%.
That's hot.
And definitely, it's been a long time actually since I've been somehow muddling around in low proof whiskey and not very heavily peated things for a while. So the PX McCarthy's is, I mean, lovely as ever, but it's coming across strong today.
It's got that nice raisiny note and that sort of like fruit leather.
Yeah, it's funny, you guys. This is kind of an entire side note. Just in a lot of people who talk like peat bomb style Scotch whiskies, I've always enjoyed the Ardbeg Supernova more so than the Octomore, just because Ardbeg itself tends to have that inherent sweetness to the whiskey, and so I think the sweetness tends to balance out the smoky bitterness of the peat much more effectively. And I'm sure that people have their own preference for how Brookladdock makes their Octomore, and I'm not in any way saying that this is the objective best. For my palate, I've always just enjoyed Ardbeg so much more because how that sweetness balances out. And so I can see with that, maybe that more cask strength McCarthy style, adding that sweetness really kind of rounds out some of that smoke on the bitter smoke on the peat.
Yeah, McCarthy is actually one of the things I love about McCarthy's, just in the regular casking without the wine finish, is how bitter it is. Actually, that really works for me.
Yeah.
It just maybe as a quirk, right? And that sounds weird saying that now, considering that like I also mentioned that I had a hard time coming around on the tart, dry sherries at first. But I guess tartness and bitterness are actually kind of different things, and that bitterness is going more in a mineral coffee direction.
Yeah.
So that really works for me. But even so, adding that really sweet sherry to that flavor profile just like really balances it out and brings it up to just a whole other level.
Yeah.
And it's really indicative of how much impact sherry has on whiskey. because like the difference between the regular, and of course you can't see it behind me because it's way up high, the regular 6-year McCarthy's versus the Oloroso and Pedro Jimenez cask finished offerings, all of which are 6 years old. The differences between each of those are miles. The amount of difference that makes in how the spirit presents itself is a testament to the strength and the difference in the styles of Oloroso and Pedro Jimenez.
Yep. And incidentally, let's see if I have a convenient glass. I am using a glass today from Kilhoman Distillery.
Oh.
And I can use, yeah, you can see that. So it happens to be that my PX is in this glass, but that's neither here nor there. Kilhoman makes one of the only pheno cask sherry whiskeys that I know about. At least it was a special release, and that actually was one of my favorite Kilhomans.
Oh, really?
Something about the Kilhoman peat style plays really nicely with the tartness that the pheno brought to it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a certain amount of Kilhoman that I always kind of came across in a very good way. It's like almost cotton candy-esque with the smoke.
Mm-hmm.
And so I could see the kind of the tart dryness of the pheno playing well with that. You know, think of like cotton candy with like a crisp apple on top of it. I could see that be a good. I mean, I found with pheno and manzanilla aged casks with Scotch that it either goes very weird or is generally not necessarily a good flavor pairing. But every so often, I was like, oh, this is really good, or this is at least intellectually very interesting. But then that gets into a separate conversation about whiskeys. Where like, okay, I only want to have so many bottles of intellectually interesting in my collection.
Yes, that has definitely become a problem here, right? I have more whiskey than I could ever drink in my life at more than 200 bottles, and a lot of it is academically interesting, which is a nice way of saying I enjoyed it to learn about it, and I don't touch it anymore.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples of that was a Rausch beer, so a German-style smoked beer that had been aged in Lagavulin casks. And I'm a huge fan of Lagavulin. I love that pork brisket you get on it. And this beer was like, I don't need to ever have a second one, but this was fascinating to drink as a beer.
I haven't had that experience yet, but was it last night I brought that up with you, Phil? The Rausch beer style? Or was that another context?
It was a couple weeks ago, I think. We were talking about what smoke does to various things. Mm-hmm. Because like everything else, the way different things take smoke is very different.
Yeah. And that rich bitterness, and that, again, that for me, my palate says pork brisket when I drink Lagavulin, is that worked very well with the richness of the beer, but it's like, it's like eating, 2 or 3 creme brulees in a row, like in one sitting. It's like, oh, that's so much richness. I don't need that.
Right. Yep. Well, all right. I think that we've reached the end of the questions. Phil, I think there was a couple of questions I said last night that we should bring up, but I think we've touched on all of them, unless you can remember something that I'm forgetting. Okay.
The questions were the differences between pheno and manzanilla, and the malic acid question.
Right. And we ended up touching on the VORS age statement thing as well, which is a really interesting thing that I didn't know about before.
Last night we got off onto a weird tangent about cognac. Because there's...
Right.
Yeah.
The
fact that
the VSOP and XO and all that.
Yeah. I found it amusing that VORS was actually a Latin phrase as opposed to an English or even a Spanish denomination. So that was a fun thing there. But yeah, so having covered, I think, everything that I could possibly think of about sherry, at least until I have time to process it and come up with a whole new set of questions, I think it's about time for us to call it a day. So before we do, let me remind everyone who's still listening. First of all, thank you for listening. If you want to hang out with us, ask more questions, talk about whiskey, sherry, movies, cars, video games, whatever you want, join us in the Whiskey Lodge. It's a great place to hang out. Nathan, where can people find you?
I mean, they can certainly DM me. I'm nathan.lustau@gmail.com. I'm happy to answer questions. I I am emblematic of Sherry. I don't necessarily have a Discord or any sort of social media function for the sheer numbers of fans that I'm constantly being chased down by. But if people have questions about Sherry, I'm happy to answer them. At some point, I suspect I'll have my own podcast that'll be in layman's terms, just because anything that comes out of my mouth is automatically in layman's terms. But I haven't quite reached that point yet.
Thank you for bringing that up. I forgot that I had come up with that joke, and it was clearly your joke, right? Because you've heard it a million times.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of been dealing with the name for the past couple decades, so I'm familiar with the joke.
Yep. All right. Well, so now you know where to find us. You know where to find Nathan, and without further ado, actually, let's grab our favorite sherry of the night. If you've still got any in the glass. I think it'll come as no surprise that I'm reaching for the Palo Cortado.
Yeah, me too.
Just lovely. And so we'll cheers our way out of here. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks Nathan for being here and for giving us the benefit of 2 hours plus of your time.
Thanks for everybody wanting to come and learn about sherry. I can probably talk for another couple hours on the subject. I love the stuff.
So what's a good cheers to get us out of here? I could say thanks for, cheers. You've got the tiny Glen Carrot.
This is how much of the Palo Cortado I have left.
Well, I guess I guess you've enjoyed it then. So thanks for putting sherry in layman's terms. And cheers to that. And until next time, we'll see you in the lodge. Good night, everybody.
Cheers.